Hi everyone, I'm back to read you chapter 12 of Hudson Taylor. This title chapter is In Light of Eternity. Hudson, Maria cuddling Grace in her arms, and Wang Lei Jun, a Chinese Christian from the Bridge Street Church, stood together on the deck of the Jubilee, a speedy new clipper ship. The water slowly turned from yellow to blue as the ship cleared the Yangtze Delta and headed for the open waters of the China Sea. Hudson strained for his last look at China. His heart was so heavy he could not speak. There was still so much to do for God in China, but he could not stay. His body had betrayed him. After 6 years in China, at age 28, he had contacted tuberculosis. After putting off consulting the doctor for several months, Hudson had finally sought him out, even though he knew what the doctor would tell him. He should return home to England immediately, where good food, the best doctors, and a cooler climate would help him overcome the disease. And if he didn't return home, most likely he would die in a matter of months. The Jubilee made the trip back to England in only 4 months, which was a good thing because 1-year-old Grace screamed with teething most of the trip, and Maria got gastroenteritis, while Hudson had dysentery on top of his other health problems. Wang Lei Jun also became terribly seasick. They were all very glad when the coastline of England came into view. The Jubilee docked in Gravesend in late November 1860, and they caught a train to London. In London they made their way to Bayswater, and the home of Amelia and her new husband Benjamin Broomhall. Louisa, his youngest sister, now 20 years old, was also waiting for him there. They had a joyful, long-anticipated reunion, and after several days with Amelia and Benjamin, they took the train to Barnsley and a warm reunion with his parents. Before he left London, though, Amelia managed to persuade Hudson to cut off his queue and began wearing English clothes again. 2 weeks later, Amelia and Benjamin, as well as Aunt Hannah and Uncle Richard from Hull, arrived in Barnsley for Christmas. Maria felt welcomed into Hudson's family, and just seeing everybody again made Hudson feel better. After Christmas, they returned to London and rented a house close to London Hospital. Wang Lejeune moved in with them. Hudson went to the hospital where his former instructor told him that his liver, digestive system, and nervous system had all been badly damaged by his illness. Recuperation would be a long process, and it would be many years before his health was strong enough for him to travel overseas again. Despite the bad news, Hudson did not get depressed. There was too much to do. Although he may have left China, China had not left him. The country was continually on his mind. He bought a huge map of China and pinned it to the wall opposite the desk in his study. It was the first thing he saw when he began to work in the morning and the last thing he prayed for at night. Slowly, as he regained his strength, he began to plan for his eventual return to China, even though he had no idea when that would be. Hudson's experiences with the hospital in Ningpo had shown him the need to complete his medical training. That was why he had rented a house close to London Hospital's new medical college building. Even though he started out as an outpatient at the hospital, as soon as he was strong enough, he resumed his medical studies there. While he studied at the hospital, he started on another project. This project was the reason Wang Lejeune had accompanied them back to England. With his help and that of Frederick Gao, another missionary to China, they began the task of translating the New Testament in the Ningpo dialect from pictographs to Romanized words. This meant that instead of using pictures to represent Chinese words in the traditional way, the sounds of the words themselves were written out phonetically, using letters of the alphabet. Translating the New Testament this way would make it much easier for Chinese people and missionaries alike to learn how to read Chinese. Hudson also began recruiting workers to go to Ningpo and help John Jones run the Bridge Street Chapel, as the church there was now called. All of this kept Hudson very busy. In fact, it took 4 years to complete it all. By 1865, the New Testament had been translated, and Wang Lei Jun had returned to his family in Ningpo with the completed text. 6 new workers had also been sent to Ningpo. Dr. Parker himself, having remarried, returned to restart the hospital, and Hudson had his medical degree. He was a member of the Royal College of Surgeons and had the title Doctor in front of his name. During this time, Hudson received no wages for his efforts, so he and Maria relied on God to meet their needs. Sometimes God's provision arrived at the last moment, but always, even when their 3 new sons, Herbert, then Howard, and finally little Samuel were born, there was enough money for the rent and food. As the days went by and Hudson studied the large map on his wall, an idea began to grow in his mind. China had 11 provinces and one territory, Mongolia. Hudson prayed for them every day. How hard would it be to recruit 2 missionaries to go into each of these areas? By year's end, every province in China could have its own missionaries sharing the gospel with the people there. The idea excited him. It would take only 24 missionaries to do it. It could easily be done if the mission societies with missionaries already in China agreed to take part in the plan. So Hudson began visiting the local representatives of these societies to get them to help. The representatives he visited were polite but firm. They all gave the same answer. They didn't have enough money or the right personnel to send missionaries into the interior. It was hard enough to support the missionaries already in China. In fact, the year before there had been a total of 115 Protestant missionaries in China. This year the number was down to 91. Hudson, they pointed out, needed to accept the reality that China was no longer a fashionable place to send missionaries. It was dangerous and very foreign. Hudson could hardly believe what he was hearing. With that kind of attitude, there would be no missionaries left in China in a few years, and just at the time when the country was really beginning to open up. They had to keep sending missionaries. Every month, more than 1 million Chinese people died without ever hearing about Jesus Christ. Over and over, Hudson asked himself this question: why wasn't someone doing something? As he thought about it, the question slowly and quietly turned itself around in his mind. Why aren't I doing something? Deep in his heart, he struggled with the answer. He knew there was no one in England better suited to recruit a group of missionaries to move into the heart of China than he and Maria, but he did not want the responsibility for other people's lives. It was too great a load to bear, having others rely on him for their safety and guidance. On his return to China, Dr. Parker had fallen off a horse into an icy river and drowned. One of the 6 missionaries Hudson had recruited and sent to Ningpo had contracted cholera and died. Even his good friend John Jones had become so sick that he had to return to England. On the voyage home he had died and now lay buried on some faraway forgotten island. Such sad news made Hudson long to be in China to help and encourage those left working there. But how could he accept the responsibility for the lives of others who might go? He felt caught in the middle. Part of him wanted to organize an all-out missionary assault on China, but another part of him was too scared to ask people to go, knowing he would be responsible for them. Hudson became very stressed over the whole matter. He couldn't seem to sleep or eat, and his health was starting to deteriorate again. Maria could see the strain in her husband, and she was pleased when he announced he was going to Brighton for a few days' rest. He would stay with Mr. Berger, the man who had begun supporting the hospital work in Ningpo right at the time they ran out of money. Maria hoped the sea air and the Christian fellowship would help clear Hudson's mind. Unfortunately, the large church filled with happy, healthy, rich Christians had the opposite effect on Hudson. He found it hard to sit and listen to people singing about God and their salvation while not seeming to care whether ones went to their eternal death without ever hearing the gospel. Hudson could no longer stand to be in the service. He slipped out a side door and as the organ music faded behind him, walked down to Brighton Beach. He took off his shoes and socks and waded in the water. His heart was as tossed and turned as the seaweed floating in the surf. He had to resolve the struggle he felt inside. As the waves lapped around his feet, a thought suddenly occurred to him. What was the worst thing that could happen to a missionary in his care? What if he took a group of missionaries back to China and they all died? How bad would that be in the light of eternity? They would all go straight to heaven. And if, as a result of their work and sacrifice, one Chinese person turned to Christ, wouldn't that make it worthwhile? Strangely, this backward way of looking at things comforted Hudson. In the light of eternity, there was no fate worse than for the Chinese people never to hear the gospel. As he thought about all this, his mind began to clear. If each missionary was obeying God and going to China, the responsibility for what happened to them rested with God and not with Hudson Taylor. Tears of joy slid down his cheeks. The answer to his struggle was so simple. He was going to do what he felt God was calling him to do, and he would trust that others exercised the same obedience. Standing in ankle-deep water on Brighton Beach, Hudson prayed and asked God to raise up 24 workers for China. Then he pulled a pencil from his pocket and wrote in the back of his Bible, "Prayed for 24 willing, skillful laborers at Brighton, June 25, 1865. The next day, he returned to London a new man. The inner conflict was settled. It was time to move forward. Now he had to prepare for what God wanted him to do. He went to the London and County Bank and with £10 opened a bank account in the name of the China Inland Mission. Next, Hudson took all the information he'd gathered together to try to convince existing missionary societies to join his plan, and he put it into a booklet. He called the booklet China's Spiritual Need and Claims. The booklet set out plainly how 400 million Chinese people had never heard the gospel. Yet they had a right to hear it, and Christians in other lands around the world had a duty to follow Jesus' command to go into all the world and preach the gospel. The booklet made many Christians feel uncomfortable. Was it possible that they were partly responsible for the million people in China who died each month without knowing of Jesus Christ? Even though it made people feel uncomfortable, China's Spiritual Need and Claims was a bestseller. It was reprinted time and again as more and more people read it and shared it with their friends. It was as if God had been waiting for Hudson to make a commitment before unleashing his blessing. And what was at first a dribble and then a flood, money, supplies, and workers began to pour in. Some readers were so inspired by what Hudson had written that they wrote and told him his vision wasn't big enough. A wealthy friend, Lord Radstock, wrote, "I read your pamphlet on the way down here and have been greatly stirred about it. Dear brother, enlarge your desires. Ask for 100 laborers, and the Lord will give them to you." Enclosed with the letter was a check for £100. As workers and money flooded in, people began asking Hudson how the new mission would work and what its rules were. They were good questions, but Hudson didn't have the answers to them. So he gathered together a group of trusted friends and church leaders to pray and ask God to show them how the mission should work. Over several days of meetings, 6 principles emerged that they all agreed the new mission should be based upon. The principles were: the workers could be from any Christian denomination as long as they agreed to work together. 2. The missionaries would not receive a salary from China Inland Mission, but together they would trust God to supply all their needs. 3. The China Inland Mission would never ask for money from anyone except God. 4. The mission leaders in China would be free to make decisions about what to do next and would not have to wait for orders from England. 5. The workers would be part of an organized plan to evangelize the whole of China. 6. China Inland Mission missionaries would live as much like Chinese people as they possibly could. They would wear Chinese clothes, eat with chopsticks, and live in Chinese-style homes. The years of quiet recuperation, study, and translation were over for the Taylors. There were so many things to organize and supervise. By May 1866, Hudson had spoken at meetings and rallies from one end of England to the other, as well as in Scotland and Ireland. Many people had offered prayer, money, or themselves to reach the people of China with the gospel. Time was drawing near for the Taylors, their 4 children, and the first group of 16 missionaries to leave for China. When they arrived in China, they would be joined by the missionaries Hudson had recruited earlier and sent to Ningpo. All the group needed now was several £100s to pay for their passage and a ship with enough space to transport them all. Hudson had seen God work in many wonderful ways during the past 4 years in London. He had no doubt God would quickly meet the remaining needs. While the team waited in London to see how God would get them to China, Hudson accepted an invitation to speak at a large gathering at a place called Totteridge. The gathering was like so many others Hudson had spoken at in the past few months. It was organized by John Puget, a retired Army colonel. During the service, Hudson held up a map of China and told those in attendance about his plan to reach the whole interior of the country with the gospel. He used Scotland as an example. In Scotland, there were several thousand ministers to care for Scottish Christians, and everyone had access to Bibles and Christian books. In China, it was the exact opposite. There was not even one minister for every 4,000 people in China. Surely, Hudson pointed out, it was the duty of Christians in Scotland and every other Christian nation to reach out to China. After he finished speaking, Hudson dismissed the meeting and sat down. Nobody moved. The room was silent. People had never heard the challenge to take the gospel to every person put quite the way Hudson had put it. Colonel Puget, who was a quick thinker, saw a wonderful opportunity. The new mission surely needed money, and many people in the audience would be glad to give it. The colonel jumped to his feet. "Brothers and sisters in Christ," he began, "tonight we have heard from a remarkable man with a remarkable vision. The flyer advertising this meeting said there would be no money collected, but I know many of you would be upset if you could not give. I am sure Dr. Taylor would not mind if we took a collection." Now it was Hudson's turn to jump to his feet. "Mr. Chairman, I beg you to keep to the conditions we agreed to," he said. "If after thought and prayer the congregation is satisfied that a gift of money is what God wants them to give, then it can be given to any missionary society with missionaries in China, or it can be mailed to our London office." Later that night at Colonel Puget's house, where Hudson was staying, the colonel challenged Hudson about his views. Why not let people give to God's work if they want to, he asked. Hudson explained that often money is the easiest thing to give. I think a collection tends to leave the impression that the all-important thing is money, whereas no amount of money can convert a single soul. What is needed is men and women filled with the Holy Spirit to give themselves to the work. There will never be a shortage of funds for the support of such people, he said. Colonel Puget shook his head. I think you are mistaken. A good opportunity was lost tonight. The two men went to bed, and the next morning Hudson was up bright and early. He was in the middle of breakfast when a letter arrived from London. It was from Maria, and he ripped it open, eager to read how things were going. As he read it, he smiled. A ship big enough for them all had just docked. It was called the Lemmermuir, and it was looking for passengers for its next trip to Shanghai, leaving May 26th. Hudson was still thinking of all he had to do, including praying about the remaining money they needed for the trip to Shanghai, when Colonel Puget came in. The colonel looked tired and ate his breakfast in near silence. When he had finished eating, he asked Hudson to follow him into his study. He cleared his throat and began speaking. Last night I was convinced you were wrong about the collection. Now I'm convinced you were right. As I thought about what you said in the meeting and the ceaseless flow of people headed to a Christless eternity, I could only pray as you suggested. Lord, what would you have me do? I think I obtained the guidance I sought, and here it is. Colonel Puget handed Hudson a check for £500. If there had been a collection last night, I would have only put in a £5 note, he added. Hudson thanked Colonel Puget for his hospitality and for the money and hurried back to London. He knew just what to do with the money when he got there. He met with Captain Bell and inspected the Lemmermuir. The ship was perfect for their plans. She was 2 years old, a square rigger with a steel frame and 3 masts, and Captain Bell assured Hudson she could withstand the fiercest storm. Hudson handed Colonel Puget's check to Captain Bell as down payment on their passage. The captain, a new Christian, was delighted at the prospect of having a band of missionaries aboard his ship, though he warned Hudson that the crew was a rough bunch. Hudson hurried back to the house to tell the rest of the group that they were officially on their way to China. We'll come back soon. We'll be reading Chapter 13 in Hudson Taylor.